The night grows quieter when you stand at the edge. Not just the edge of a cliff carved by wind and time, but the edge of certainty itself, where one wrong step could erase everything you believe about safety, control, and tomorrow. There is a special kind of fear that lives in high places. It is not loud at first. It creeps in slowly, tightening your chest as you realize how small you are and how wide the darkness below has become. Tonight's stories are not simply about falling bodies or sharp rocks waiting beneath. They are about those terrifying seconds when the ground disappears, when the soul is forced to choose between surrender and survival. These are true and folklore-based cliffhanger horror stories. Moments where ordinary people stood suspended between life and death, fear and faith, despair and hope, and discovered something powerful about themselves that they never knew existed. The first story begins on a fog-choked mountain ridge, where silence presses so hard it feels heavier than sound. Daniel was not reckless by nature. He was careful, thoughtful, the kind of man who double-checked notes and studied maps before every hike. But fear does not always wait for foolishness. Sometimes it finds even the prepared. That afternoon, the weather turned suddenly. Fog rolled in like a living thing, swallowing the trail and muting the world. The path narrowed, the wind sharpened, and visibility dropped to a few trembling feet. Daniel decided to keep moving instead of turning back, telling himself it was only a short stretch. That decision, small and almost forgettable, was all it took. His foot slipped on loose gravel, and in a heartbeat his body slammed sideways, momentum dragging him toward nothingness. He did not scream. Shock stole his voice. His hands scraped rock until skin tore, until blood warmed the cold stone, until somehow his fingers caught a tiny outcrop no wider than a book. Below him, the cliff fell away into white fog, so deep and silent it felt unreal, like staring into the absence of the world. Above him, the rock face offered no obvious grip, only smooth, indifferent stone. Minutes passed, then hours. His arms shook violently. Pain spread like fire from his shoulders to his fingertips. The cold bit deeper as the sun sank, and fear began to speak clearly now. It told him he was alone. It showed him images of his hands slipping, of his body tumbling end over end, into a place where no one would ever find him. His mind replayed every mistake he had ever made, every reason he didn't deserve to survive. The cliff seemed to lean closer, as if listening. At some point, exhaustion became heavier than terror. That was when a memory surfaced, uninvited but steady. His mother, sitting at the kitchen table years ago, telling him that life is survived one breath at a time. Not tomorrow, not next year, just the next breath. Daniel forced himself to inhale slowly, then exhale, ignoring the screaming in his muscles. He stopped thinking about rescue. He stopped thinking about falling. He narrowed his world down to the space between each breath. As the night deepened, something shifted. Fear did not vanish, but it loosened. In the dim light, he noticed a thin crack in the rock just above his left hand, something he had been too panicked to see before. Moving was agony. Every inch felt impossible. Still, he moved. A millimeter at a time, skin tearing further, muscles trembling, but his will refusing to break. He whispered to himself, reminders that he was still alive, that this moment was not the end of his story. When dawn finally arrived, it felt unreal, like waking inside someone else's dream. The fog thinned. A rescue helicopter appeared, its sound shattering the silence he had lived inside all night. When they pulled him to safety, the rescuers said most people would have let go long before help arrived. Daniel could not explain how he survived. He only knew that when everything else slipped away, his will became the last rope. That cliff taught him that life does not always ask you to be strong in obvious ways. Sometimes it only asks you to refuse to let go, even when your hands are bleeding and your heart is begging for rest. Fear is loud, but it is not always truthful. Along the rugged cliffs of Mahar, there is an old tale shared quietly among fishermen and villagers. It speaks of a man walking home late at night, waves crashing far below, wind howling so fiercely it sounded like voices calling his name. As he walked closer to the edge, he began to hear whispers, urging him forward, promising relief from exhaustion and pain. The closer he stepped, the stronger the voices became, until the ground beneath him nearly vanished. In that frozen second, another sound cut through the noise, softer than the wind, quieter than the sea. It was a prayer his father used to recite before every voyage. Without fully understanding why, the man stepped backward instead of forward. The voices stopped instantly. The wind remained. The sea roared. But the whispers were gone. He returned home shaken, knowing that fear had tried to guide him somewhere final, and faith, barely audible, had saved his life. There are moments when fear will shout instructions at you, convincing you that panic is logic and despair is realism. But wisdom often arrives as a whisper, asking you to pause, to breathe, to step back, instead of forward. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet enough to be missed, unless you are listening carefully. High in the mountains of Nepal, a solo climber learned the cost of pride when the cliff decided to teach him humility. Experienced and confident, he ignored warnings of an incoming storm, trusting his skill more than the sky. As snow and ice swallowed the rock face, his planned route disappeared. Night fell fast, trapping him on a narrow ledge, barely wide enough to sit. The wind screamed, and the cold gnawed through his gear and into his bones. For hours, he told himself he could handle it, that calling for help meant failure. But pride is a heavy thing to carry when survival is at stake. As hypothermia crept in and his thoughts blurred, he finally reached for his radio and asked for help. A legend from the Andes tells of two brothers crossing a dangerous pass when a sudden slide left them stranded on a precipice. One panicked, moving wildly, shouting into the void. The other stayed still, conserving energy, waiting. When rescue came, only one brother was alive. The mountain did not choose between them. Their responses did. Hope is stronger than gravity, even when it looks fragile. In Yosemite, a climber slipped and fell, catching himself on a single exposed root growing from the cliff face. That root bent under his weight but did not break. For long minutes, it was all that stood between him and the void. He later said that, holding on to that root, felt like holding on to belief itself in, uncertain, but powerful enough to keep him alive until help arrived. These cliffhanger horror stories remind us that life will bring edges we never planned to stand on. There will be moments when fear surrounds us, when the future disappears into fog, when pain and silence and doubt feel unbearable. In those moments, survival is not about being fearless. It is about holding on anyway. It is about listening for the quiet voice beneath the noise, choosing patience over panic, humility over pride, hope over surrender. May you find strength when your hands feel weak, courage when the ground feels far away, and peace when fear tries to push you forward. May God guard your steps on dangerous paths, steady your heart when darkness closes in, and give you the resilience to hold on until the light returns. Even when you find yourself standing at the edge of your own cliffhanger horror story,